Yeah.
Cool.
That's all.
So we can start, right?
Yeah.
Hi everyone. I'm Stefan. I've did too many years of debating, and I'm happy to give a workshop on one of the areas, well, broadly, let's say an overview of one of the areas that I found both particularly interesting, but in many ways challenging for both me and a lot of speakers I've seen at various levels of experience during the time I spent debating. It was largely different areas of economics. Now, obviously, it's a very broad academic discipline. That's why people study it for years and years, and we can't have an exhaustive list of all the topics we to cover tonight, but I do intend to cover at least some of those, and especially some which you might find particularly challenging. So before we start, I just want to go through a few technical points. One, can I just see how many, so I want to have some insight as to what the broad level of experience in this group is. So how many people here did more than, let's say, how many people here spoke at a debating competition before? Cool, everyone. How many did more than 3?
What debating competitions?
Yeah. Okay, more than 5? More than 10? Cool. So yeah, this is roughly the level for which this workshop is intended, which is you presumably know what the arguments that come up in various economic debates are, but at times you may struggle with developing or making those arguments sufficiently sophisticated. Am I roughly correct in saying that that's an issue many of you might have seen in various debates? Cool. Aside from that, just one other technical point I want to make. This workshop, as well as most workshops which I do, are semi-structured. What I mean by that is that I roughly have about 30 to 40 minutes of material prepared. I apologize for the delay in the start of this, blame Ryanair. So if you find it interesting or there are issues you want us to cover, then this can become very, very long. If not, we might finish this on the original time schedule. So I have some things I want to talk about, but before we go into that, can I hear from people, from whomever, what was a particular source of arguments or subgroups of debates within economics that you found challenging and would like for us to cover tonight? So anything I want to check what people found a challenge and then definitely emphasize that we go through that at one point. Yeah.
So international markets, especially.
Oh. Cool.
So here I mean especially one debate about Europe of 2 speeds. So
Well, it may be funny as in.
I write horribly. These notes are more for me than for you.
Currencies.
So about currency, so like what, the euro or?
Like how they work, basically. I mean the worth and.
So that's the markets actually.
Yeah.
Alright, I mean that is very broad, and you can have a workshop just on financial markets or a degree just on financial markets or parts of them. But I'll try and go through some things that commonly come up in those debates. Other things? Yes?
Non-free market arguments. We had a debate at the Red Sea Open, I think, which said whether a country should support stuff like automation or deliberately not. And I found it hard to come up with arguments that said you shouldn't.
Okay. Other issues?
The impact of migrants on the employment.
not strictly related to economic solutions, but basically how to deal with varying levels of experience in a subject matter in a room, also regarding the judging panel and the teams.
Okay, so is this more related to when judges know things and teams don't, or vice versa, or both?
A bit of both, but mostly vice versa. So, how to approach an economic solution if you know stuff about the subject matter, but clearly the judges and the other teams don't, and so how to avoid being shut out of the debate.
That's a good point. That's interesting. We'll go into that. Other ideas or questions?
So protectionism comes of bottom, I think.
Other things?
How to argue with utilitarianistic values.
I mean, that doesn't strictly fit with an econ, but I'll definitely look at that. Yeah. Other things? I mean, we have quite a lot of material already. So if people have ideas, I'm also happy to. You feel free to raise that question at any particular point in time, or if there's anything you want us to go back to. And I will go through this list at the end, I promise, and we'll see whether the questions, the issues you had, were sufficiently well answered. So other than that, just 3 caveats I want to make about this before we start. The first one is, I study business, so I'm not a proper economist. I don't perfectly understand models, but I know how they work in debating, and I largely understand economics within debating. I may struggle a bit at times with some of the academic stuff. So it might be very likely that some of you know more about the theoretical stuff than I do. If you have a disagreement, feel free to point it out. I just think one thing that's worth noting is something which relates to the second caveat I want to make here, which is that often, I think this applies to all areas of debating. We debate a variety of areas. Social theories, the environment, minority groups, economics, and each one of those is an area of studies in themselves, and each one of those people have done PhDs, postdocs, wrote books on them. So it's inevitable that we have to an extent simplify and make them compelling to a judge who is reasonably informed, whatever that may mean. So I will necessarily, on occasion, simplify some points in order to adjust them more to a debating setting. I think it is fair to say that some of those will be partially inaccurate in a more technical economic sense, but it's nonetheless one that will work in 99% of debates. The third caveat I want to make here is that so I will discuss a broad array of issues and perspectives and arguments that commonly come up, both from the left and the right. My take on how it least worked when I was active in debating was that people often struggled with going particularly far with, let's say, more liberal economic arguments, and I'll possibly focus on those slightly more, but it's not about what issues or views I hold personally, but it's more about the issues which I commonly found people struggling with. So those are just some general ground rules I wanted to set before we start. Do you have any questions before we go into the matter? No, cool. So from this list, what I'd suggest doing at the very start is because at the end everyone will be tired, and I think at that point we won't do some of these issues justice. I want to look at the ones which I'd say are not which are an isolated area or are not strictly connected to economics. So from this list, I think one we can easily look at from the very beginning is how to how to approach or make non-utilitarian arguments within debating. It's not something I necessarily prepare for this workshop, but a thing I did prepare before, so it's not a big issue for me to run through it. I think one thing that is worth pointing out and is repeated again and again and again is that in 99% of debates, your judges will be utilitarians, and a debate will revert back to a utilitarian framework of weighing the benefits of harms of a policy, action, whatever. So the way I think non-utilitarian arguments can be made in some instances, and I think this also differs from judge to judge. I think the first thing I'd point out is that they are very difficult to make because the cost-benefit framework or underpinning of utilitarian argument is one that is just incredibly intuitive to people to an extent that it doesn't require a great degree of explanation for at least for most judges. However, non-utilitarian frameworks, because they are non-intuitive, often require a lot of explaining. What I mean by this is, when you choose to make those arguments, you will spend significantly more time than had you just reverted to a deontological, to a utilitarian default. At that point, you need to ask yourself whether it is worth the time spent. I think that's the first thing I'd point there. I think secondly, are people, I assume at least some people are aware of the small differences between rule and act utilitarianism. Okay, I think that's something that is a good starting point for when you want to make non-utilitarian arguments or not strictly utilitarian arguments. So, act utilitarianism is probably the one that is most familiar to you. It is every single action which individuals make, or groups, or states, or whatever, should be justified or non-justified based on weighing of the harms and benefits of said action. That might be more people taken out of poverty, more minority groups included in society, more lives saved, most commonly. And those are weighed against some potential harms. Rule utilitarianism is a bit more nuanced. So what it says is that not every single action should be weighed based on specific harms and benefits of that action, but that in general, rules that exist in society should be weighed based on whether overall they create more benefits than harm. So here's a trivial example, and then we'll look at a slightly more realistic debatey example. And I think this can be a good starting point from where you can get ideas to run those sorts of arguments. So, if you're driving a car, and so say you're driving in a very small secluded street at 2 a.m. or at 2 in the morning, there is a traffic light there. And you stop at that traffic light because the red light has turned on. It is 2 in the morning. Let's say that there are no buildings around, so you can, and it's a night that is very bright because of moonlight. So you can see all around you very well. If there was a car coming from any direction, or let's say that there are no pedestrians go through that area for the sake of simplicity. So the only way you can have an accident is by colliding with a car. But you can see everywhere and you see no cars are coming. You will still stop at that traffic light. The reason why people do that is presumably because they don't want to pay a fine. But why would you still be fined if you cross the red light at 2 in the morning at that instance?
I mean, it's more about the general approach to law, that we don't want people to think about it too much. We don't want them to start to weigh when it's okay to break it because nobody will get harmed, because we believe that they're just humans, so they will be mistaken from time to time, and they will break it when they shouldn't have. Yep. So for the sake of the general well-being of people, it's better for them to just blindly accept it.
Yeah, I mean, roughly that's it. In that particular instance, it's probably more beneficial than harmful for that individual to cross the road on a red light. I mean, he saves on gas, he saves the environment, he has more disposable income, and there's no realistic harm. However, if in every single instance, particular individuals were to make decisions on whether to break a general rule, overall, the societal outcome would be bad, because in that case, it might be true that there are more benefits than harms to him crossing the street on a red light. But by and large, people aren't very well placed to make that decision, because we had an extreme example, but in most cases, you can misjudge the distance from a different car. You cannot see incoming traffic, all sorts of issues. So while you have that in the legal system, is because of that reason. So now let's look at something that is, I think, more debate related. So I think can give you a better idea of how you use those examples in debating. So one internet series that was and still is very popular with both political theorists and debaters is Michael Sandel's series that's called Justice, and it covers a lot of broader, let's say, introductory political philosophy arguments. So I think if you're interested in those sorts of things, how different political and moral philosophies work, it's definitely worth taking a look. It's about 16 episodes. He's a great speaker. The lectures are very interactive. So you should definitely watch that. So in one of the lectures, he is discussing the various forms of utilitarianism, including the trolley problem. I assume people know what the trolley problem is. It is you're driving a train down the tracks. The brakes someone cut the brakes. If you don't move the train, you'll kill 5 people, but you can press a switch, and then you will just switch to a parallel track, and then you kill 1 person. Should you press the switch? A deontological and absolute moralist will say no, because by doing so, by pressing the switch, even though you're killing less people, you're actively committing the act of killing, whereas if you don't, you're just letting things be. A utilitarian, of course, would say 1 life lost is better than 5 lives lost. And he asked that question in class. Of course, 90% of people say they'd switch to the opposite track. He asked a different question. There's a train going down the tracks. Brakes have been cut. There is no one in the cabin, and it's about to kill 5 people on the tracks who can't get away. And you're standing you're crossing an overpass. There's this fat guy hanging over and looking at the train. If you push him, he'll just slow the train down so it doesn't kill the other 5 people. At that point, most people still say that they would push the fat guy over, but not as much. And there's the third analogy, which is you're a doctor, you're a surgeon. You have 10 people or 20 people who are in need of organ transplants, and each one needs a different organ. One needs a kidney, the other one needs a liver, and all of them will die within the next 24 hours if they don't get their organs. And it's very unlikely that any, let alone most of them, will get new organs within the next 24 hours. And that same day, a very healthy person, a sports person, comes in for a regular check and is just asleep in the room where you're about to do the check. So would you slit their throat? When it comes to that question, most people, of course, say no, but they don't really justify it except claiming that it's just not, if you're a doctor, you have special obligations. But I think there is also a specific argument here that can be made from a perspective of rule utilitarianism, which is, in that particular instance, sure, you might save 20 lives, but if doctors kept slitting people's throats all the time when they show up for regular checks, not many people would go to the doctors, probably, which ultimately would probably lead to even more people dying. So that's I guess an idea of an argument that might be slightly more useful for debating. So I think that's one area which you can explore when making non-standard utilitarian arguments. I think the other which might be explored is, so it's more of a let's say, it's a disguised appeal to authority. So claiming that there are certain inalienable rights. And I think the analogy with the doctor and the patients can be used in a similar respect. So you mostly have claims about, for instance, dignity and the people's rights, regardless of what society says. So a classic example of claiming why not everything should be utilitarian is the state doesn't decide how I spend my money. If I want to spend everything on Coke or drinks, I can do so, even though my money could probably be spent in a more socially util way, because we value the right of individuals to make different choices, and we respect that right all the time. We value people's right to dignity. That's why we often let them choose the way in which they want to be buried. I mean, there's probably more sense in terms of saving space by cremating people instead of putting them in the ground and having huge graveyards that take large parts of town, because that's what they want to happen with their bodies after they die. Admittedly, all of these points are phrased in a way that you pretty much end at the premise, which is you just assert that there is a right to dignity or a right to choice. You would prove those big claims by providing some analogies. For instance, the right to dignity, you could also claim that the state doesn't have a right to act in fully utilitarian ways. That's why we don't just kill people to harvest their organs. So the previous analogy. And go from there and try to prove the many points you wanted to make, and claim, therefore, not all decisions should be made in a fully utilitarian manner. However, I think there are two things worth pointing out here. The first one is, when we teach people debating, we tell them it's not really about how you speak or your style. It's much more about the argument you have. And I think that is, to a large extent, true. Much more in debating than I think I'd be an awful public speaker, but I was fairly better than that in debating. But the point is, when you try and make deontological arguments of this sort, the right to dignity, I think the style which you have when making them adds, and it's important to persuasion because they are not based on logic as much. So it requires a bit more of pauses, being very clear, trying to make analogies that seem perfectly clear to judges, stopping at dramatic or important points in the argument. I think that's very important when you try to make these sorts of arguments. I think that's the first thing I'd say there. The second thing, however, is even when you make them, never put all your eggs in the deontological basket. It is more likely than not to backfire. It is an unfortunate reality of a lot of BP debating that many judges will simply not buy deontological arguments. They will discard them. Unfortunately, I feel that it is especially prevalent on the ESL and EFL circuits, because often judges are just wired to think about things mechanically, partially because of language differences, partially because of less developed circuits. But essentially, I found it very difficult to make them with, let's say, non-top ESL judges in many situations. And I try to do my work on changing that, but it is a reality. And I think the second bit as to why you need to have a backup is because it's very, very, and I think this is a reason why many people find them difficult to assess. Because when you're judging a debate at the end, essentially judges are also utilitarians. When they are comparing teams, unless if they are very good judges, they find it very difficult. Not sure how many of you had opportunities to judge debates, but often you have a bit of a chaotic discussion for 5 or 6 minutes when you try to reach some sort of agreement with your wings, who are often less experienced than you. Sometimes you manage to reach some sort of basis. More often you don't. So you try to get a criteria that you'll work on, and often what people revert to is the easiest one, and that again is utilitarianism. So what I'd say is, when you make them, I think the two ways in which I discussed are possible ways in which you can look into making those arguments. You can go through Sandel's theories if you're interested in that sort of thing, or in political philosophy in general. But I would definitely not in a case focus on making them entirely. And the way you do it, obviously, is after you spend your time on your deontological argument, you say, but even if you do not buy that, here is why they lose on a utilitarian metric as well. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question we had on utilitarian or non-utilitarian arguments?
I have a question.
Yes.
So basically, you're presenting arguments and framing that you could win in if you're presenting arguments which are non-utilitarian, and you provided the example of firstly, like you cannot spend your own money, as in it would be utilitarian that the state would take your money and spend it more wisely, etc., because it would bring more benefits, right?
Mm-hmm.
But basically, that would counter utilitarian because people would lose utility, as in people gain utility when they have the opportunity to spend money on the things they like. So in essence,
Sure.
would
But
lose utility, right?
I understand, but if the state should be utility maximizing, if the main goal of the state should be to increase the overall utility, i.e. the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people in society. The money I spend on buying a new car is money that could be spent feeding probably a few thousand people for a day who don't have the opportunities to access food. Admittedly, that's why you have taxation, because they need to be fed. But there are still people who are not fed, and you still let me spend money on an expensive car that I don't need, whereas I can only take public transportation. The loss of utility to me is having a few smelly people in the bus. A loss of utility to many people is not having food on the table. But even in that case, the state doesn't make the decision to take money away from individuals because it, to an extent, respects their right to do so. Again, there are many examples when the state mitigates or prefers some choices over others. Sin taxes, the extra taxes you have on cigarettes or drinks are an example of that. But you still, to an extent, value people having choices. Again, the response to that is because if you did not let people have choices at all, they wouldn't have an incentive to maximize their own individual utility, which would overall lead to less total societal utility. So that's the way the clash works. But these are the starting points for the two sides, and that's where you have to make one more compelling than the other. I hope this answers your question. So can we consider utilitarianism closed for the minute?
Yeah.
Cool. In terms of the other one, so I think what I'd approach at this point are the two issues which I think are relatively isolated in the sense that there is little overlap between them and the rest of the things which I will discuss. So let's look at the impacts of immigration and automation. Let's look at the latter first. This is an incredibly political issue, as you may imagine, and it is difficult to get hold of. Objective data because the way in which it is interpreted differs on what your political views are or who's funding your think tank. But let's say the overall consensus, or at least the one that exists probably within the communities you're likely to run into in debating, is that immigrants by and large benefit the economy. I think the reasons for that are fairly intuitive. They often do jobs which people who are domestic citizens don't want to do. They contribute back to the state through taxation. Most immigrants, I think this is an important point. So for states in general, you are likely to create a net loss. So the state will spend more money on you than you will give back to it. Probably between your birth and roughly age 25, and then again from, let's say, age 65 till the day you die. So when you're still in education and when you're retired, you're an expenditure for the state. Most immigrants, not all of them, come at some point later in life. So if they're 20, 25, 30, they mostly went through their education elsewhere. So that's a significant expense. Child healthcare, which is in many places very expensive because children are different than adults and there are less of them, so people need to specialize only for a smaller overall group of people. Those costs do not exist or are lower than they are for regular regular citizens, and that is proven by statistics. And this is, I think, an exact point where depending on your political views, the statistics can get a bit tricky. So from what I read, and I mean, most of the statistics I have are about the United States because they're much more difficult to collate in Europe for some probably European political reasons, at least from what I've seen. So on average, the average immigrant contributes more to the U.S. economy than the average U.S. citizen. However, it gets more difficult when you account for age, so the things which I just mentioned. So if you look at people within the same age groups, it is difficult to ascertain who is more productive for the economy. There could be reasons as to why one or the other is true, and I want to look through those. So we covered some of the reasons as to why immigration might be particularly good for the economy from a economic sense. And I would largely want to focus on that because I'm not sure I ever fully understood culture and cultural diversity as a good or not. So I'm mostly focusing on the economic impacts of immigration. Many of them do start small businesses. They definitely do help to an extent the construction industry, obviously, when you have more people in. I think there's also an important point to be made in Europe, and I mean in Europe more than in the United States, which is that by and large, if you call them second, third, and older generations or natives, have relatively low birth rates, and we have increased lifespans and more people and decreases in population. So we were entering a sort of a demographic scissor where you need more and more spending on people who are largely retiring, but you have less and less kids. So there could be indirect benefits through immigrants coming in, and they do on average have more children than people who are natives in most countries. The argument, yes, but they change our culture and they'll do whatever with our lands, that will never win you a debating judge. So that response will never ever be able to convince any judge inside debating. So I mean, so what if you get mosques in Berlin? Most judges won't care about that, and I think you only come off as sounding racist. So you'll have a choice between being bad and awful in that instance. So I think that's something you'll have to accept. I think that there's a possible harms that immigration creates. I think the first one is there is definitely an expense of providing services to them. Many of them don't speak languages of countries they come in, which means when they go see the doctor, you'll have to get interpreters or doctors who speak their own local languages. Two, immigrants are not a homogeneous group, so this gets amplified. They speak a variety of languages. Even so, let's say most refugees who come into Europe currently are from the Middle East. So you could say they all speak Arabic, but Arabic is somewhere like 11 different dialects, some of which are not mutually intelligible at all. From what I understand, the average Moroccan struggles to understand the average Saudi. So those costs definitely do exist. Many of them do require a degree of re-education to enter into the workforce. There are also indirect expenses related to increased policing, etc., etc. There's also expenses related to the provision of services in particular areas. So because it's difficult to get them into the legal system for a lot of reasons, you don't always know how exactly many immigrants live in a particular area. So it's difficult to know what the exact level of, say, doctors or teachers in a particular area should be. I think a particularly interesting argument, even though immigration is, in general, probably more beneficial than harmful for the economy, it is a fact that a lot of blue-collar jobs are lost to immigrants. Do people know what blue-collar jobs are?
Yeah.
Yeah, so working-class jobs, essentially. And it is true that a lot of, let's say, low service level workers, simple industry workers do lose their jobs to immigrants for a number of reasons. I think this is a sort of argument you can also make in debates about outsourcing or in general free trade. What I think at that point is interesting is talking about moral obligations which a state has. So if you can conclude that even though overall the immigration benefits society more than it harms it, but it harms particular groups, let's say blue-collar workers, more, you could claim that regardless of the overall benefits you get from immigration, there is a particular moral obligation towards those people who lose jobs or who have their lives worse off because of immigration. That is the fairly generic moral obligation, just a sec, fairly generic moral obligation of the state argument, which I have ran millions of times and I'll run through it again. There are, let's say, between 2 and 3 points to it. But before that, we have a question.
I mean, that's a little bit on this topic what we are discussing, but it's also a little bit the point on itself. So the majority of the harms in terms of immigrations are economic, and like I come from a more business economic background, and I've always struggled to make judges care about economic harms and the fact that we are losing money. And like majority of the times I've heard that, I mean, the money will be there, we don't discuss money in the debates, we assume that we'll be able to afford it, and if we are weighting like the freedom of people or their lives versus billions of dollars, we don't care about money. So how do you make them like actually care about the fact that money has impact in real life?
I think that's a good point to be raised. So I will go into that when I go into the first point of what I wanted to discuss in general, but to specifically answer your question. For instance, in the US, depending on statistics, a 0.1% increase in unemployment roughly leads to about 5,000 more suicides per annum. Poorer provision of services leads to higher level of malnutrition for children, etc., etc. It leads to lower access to healthcare. So if they cost money, that means that everyone in society overall ends up being worse off. And those are not just abstract things like we lose money. That also means that the state would be unable to provide the current level of services. Yes.
But haven't you came across the judges, like the majority of the judges, that just act like you can print money as a state?
Yes. So that's why you need to. So I mean that is one of the reasons why you are unlikely to get let's say you get a motion on European immigration and refugee crisis. You're unlikely to get a motion that EU states should just open their borders. You'll more likely get a actor X should coerce actor Y to do this. So because we want to prevent that argument from happening. When it does happen, I think the point you want to raise is that in order to get more funding for something, let's say providing better quality services to people who have migrated or people who are refugees, you will need to convince increasingly xenophobic populations to vote for political parties which promise that. The big issue with immigrants is that they are not allowed to vote, which means they are not an interest group which you can protect. That's why you often have protests, because they have no alternative ways of protecting their livelihoods. At that point, how are you exactly going to get better provision of services to them when you get xenophobic parties who say, let's just deport them back to Syria coming into power? I think that's one bit you can talk about. The other bit is the more general one, which I'll cover when we get to point one of this. But if I don't, so it's the point I make about state efficiency. If I don't go through this specifically there, do feel free do feel free to remind me. So back to the moral obligation point we discussed. So I think this also to an extent applies to the utilitarian framework, because presumably what a utilitarian would say is, yeah, some people in our countries will lose jobs in factories, so they'll go on benefits. They'll have some crappy remuneration, and they'll get food stamps. True, but this is not as bad as those people staying in horrible refugee camps in Greece or in Turkey. I think what you say there is that there are specific moral obligations owed towards own citizens. The way you make the claim is that one, states have unique coercive power over their own citizens, which they do not have over citizens over other states. They can force you to vote in elections, they can conscript you, etc., etc. Two, they also have accountability to you. They do not have to other states. They are largely funded by taxation money that they mainly collect from citizens of their own state. I do not tax people who live in Syria. I do, however, tax people who live in, say, Poland. The third claim you want to make is how powerful states are in shaping your moral norms. So the things you learn in school, the patriotic songs, national history, teachers you have, are all work based on a program. Those programs were made by someone in state institutions. They are very powerful, and they don't just happen in school, they happen throughout your life, in shaping how you see reality and how you interact with other individuals. In many ways, the state has led to you becoming the person you are today, and owes unique obligations to you based on that. I think if you make it particularly well, you could make the analogy that it is to an extent similar to an obligation that exists between parents and their own children. You can say, of course, it is not to such a large extent, but the similar principle applies. So I think those are the three areas which you look at, and what you end that sort of point on is, even if there are slightly more benefits by, let's say, opening borders to people who come from war-ravaged countries or people who just want to move here in pursuit of a better life, you still owe a unique moral obligation towards your own citizens, which means you should subdue immigration into your country. Does this roughly explain most, except one of the issues that we wanted to discuss about immigration and its impacts?
Can you explain the second part once again? You said that taxing only your own, but...
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you're paying VAT here. If you earn income here, that income will be taxed here.
Yeah, but
so effectively, the institutions of these states exist to a large extent because of your tax money. You are sustaining the state, so you have effectively led to its continuation. You, as well as all other taxpayers or people who live in a country. It does not cover everyone. But let's say if we look at these three as three large concentric circles, at one point we will get a point when we are pretty much encompassing most of the population, except if you have a specific objection there.
That was not really my point. I mean, yeah, it's sustained by tax money, which is provided by the worker. So if an immigrant comes and just steals your job, it's still going to be the same tax money provided by the same worker who's still doing the same job. Just, well, the tax money is going to go from the immigrant rather than from the person to the national.
Yeah, I understand. Yes?
I want to just answer that.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, because I understand this, as if, he's going to start paying this, but the idea is that this guy who lives here paid it for the last 30, 40 years.
Oh, okay.
So his next generation has created hundreds of thousands of...
That is one part of the reason. The other part is, it's not just about the fact who will pay, but the fact that I have paid for years and years and years, or that I am currently paying, means that you owe that specific obligation to me that you do not owe to him. I think you are fair in pointing out that is one of the good responses to that sort of argument. And I think that's why in general this is not related to this workshop, but in general, when building arguments, when you reach important premises or steps in them, it might be very good to have 3 or 4 justifications for a subpoint rather than having just one. So at this point I had three essentially. This was a fairly detailed response to obligation number 2. But if you would exclusively focus on that, I'd still have 1 and 3, and I could just refocus on them. So, by the way, when you're doing your deputy speeches, it would be good to follow what subpoints that your partners made were responded to, and then defend those while also emphasizing what they did not respond to. But that's not related to your question as much as it is related to general inter-argumental strategy in general. So, can we, for the moment, close the immigration impact charter? I won't cross it out because I owe one answer yet. About automation, I will be honest. I'm not sure that's a good motion. I think overall, many of the arguments made here or the logic would apply to debates about automation. I mean, the thing you'd say about automation is jobs that mostly get automated are, again, blue-collar jobs, and go from there. I think the other issue with automation, which is currently an issue, is that there is a discussion on whether to tax it, because the point is worker salaries are taxed, there is an obligation to pay benefits for jobs that workers do, etc., etc. That does not exist for robots. And in a vast majority of countries, the taxes on wages and salaries will, together with benefits, will be overall higher than their corporate tax rates. So that as a result of automation, if you produce the same amount of products but you have one worker less, you'll just get the tax money. If you produce more, you just tax the extra more at say 10 or 15%, whereas you lose 40% of the worker's salary through lost taxation revenue. So I'll be honest, I think those are some of the areas you can look at when opting automation, or when saying automation is a bad thing. But I think it is difficult. I think it's a difficult motion, and one I probably will never set, except if something drastically changes. So, yeah, I'm really sorry about struggling to answer this question, but I'm also thankful that I did not have to speak at that motion at RSO. It might be a good idea to ask people whose views on that are different than mine. So does anyone have good ideas on except the 2 ideas which were mentioned at the start on why automation might be a bad thing? I mean, yeah.
You can make a bit broader case on saying how, while automation itself could be good for the overall society if we were to handle it well, based on past experience, we don't expect the state to handle it well. Mm-hmm. We don't believe that the state will actually use proper taxation on automation. We don't believe the state will widen benefits to the unemployed and offer retraining programs and whatever. And so we believe that the end result of automation without any checks will simply be like socio-economic disaster for the blue-collar worker. Therefore, we oppose automation until we reach a state until we reach a status where we can trust the state to actually work on these issues and come up with a solution.
Yeah, I think it's a sensible prop. I think it's a difficult one. I think you get about 2 burdens there, whereas op only has to take down one of them. But I think it's definitely a good strategy to run, for lack of a better one. So I think that makes sense. I think there is probably area for a Marxist case here. I have never run one successfully, so I will not give advice on that. But you might ask at one point the successful debaters who are Marxist on how to run that case within a debating system. I have at occasions tried to think about how I'd run a Marxist case. I never reached a conclusion which I found compelling. It could be that I just was better at other things. It could be that you can't successfully run them within debating. But yeah, so there is space for a Marxist case. There is what Lamine mentioned, and there are the 2 initial ideas which I had. I think those are some ideas you could have for upping or running cases on automation. I think the argumentation on why automation might be good are fairly intuitive to people. And I think the more that I think about it, yeah, if you want to run a case that lasts for 14 minutes, what Lamine mentioned is probably a good idea, which is, it might not be in theory bad, but here is how it will look in practice because states are crap and are beholden to corporate interests. And that actually does lead to one point which I do want to discuss. So, can we for the moment consider the automation chapter closed? Cool. Okay, so what I want to look at, and what I think is actually convenient when discussing states, is in debating, we often discuss why private companies are terrible at making decisions on a large swathe of issues. How they pollute the environment, how they do not follow labor laws, how they treat their workers horribly, and in many cases that is true. What I found very, very interesting is that very few times have I seen arguments about how states allocate resources being run effectively. And I think this somewhat covers the points we had about immigration previously, and why states might be bad actors for doing anything. So for instance, in debates about progressive taxation, what I typically find the prop being is the bucket list of arguments you have for why progressive taxation or even higher rates of progressive taxation are good. Obligations owed towards the poorest, the fact that a lot of the money you earn is due to institutions that the state provides, the relative feeling of inequality, how it causes depression, many other areas. The changes in the knowledge economy, etc., etc. I did find people often struggling with the op case. What the op case typically would be is, yeah, but they deserve the money, or in more exotic cases, taxation is slavery. But essentially, I rarely found a particularly compelling op. What I think people often oversee, and this is where we go back to the caveats I make at the beginning, I don't think this is a foolproof case, nor one that is extremely good in most circumstances. But I think it is an area of exploration where you do want to, where you have difficult ops, like the case of automation or possibly cases of progressive taxation. So typically, if you have progressive taxation, or if you have less automation, you'll have more tax revenue, and you have more revenues in state budgets. And we just assume that money will be spent on providing nice things to people that evil companies do not provide to people. But people never really do bother justifying that, do they? I haven't ever seen a proper explanation of why the state is a good allocator of resources. Admittedly, I never really saw that being particularly challenging. Here are some ideas as to why the state might be a particularly bad actor for allocating resources. One, it is often beholden to specific interest groups. This might be own bureaucracies who tend to increase their own power. It may be things like the revolving door policy, where you work at state positions for a few years just so that you go and work at a large multinational or a large bank. So you make deals happen for those future employers. You might in general be beholden to corporate interests, so you won't make automation happen in a good way. There are many reasons for that. I think the second thing you can discuss here is how states are grossly ineffective at allocating resources. The reasons for that is, one, often they don't have perfect information. Two, they often don't have strong incentives to collect information. So typically people who are bureaucrats are mostly not paid on achievements, i.e. you don't have in most cases and in most states, you don't have an independent audit after whatever was done and seeing how many people actually benefited from your new welfare program and basing your salary based on that. So many people who are in bureaucracies don't have their incentives aligned with being inefficient. That's why you often hear anecdotes about very easy state-level jobs where no one does anything. Admittedly, that's caricaturing it, but in many cases, you could claim that because of a lack of incentives, there is no particular reason for people to be efficient in doing their jobs, as to say, compared to, say, what actors in markets might do. I think the last thing you say here, purely theoretically, is, unlike, say, private institutions, states don't really have competition. If the state is crappy at providing welfare, you won't have a private actor who will jump in and provide welfare more efficiently in a large number of cases. Obviously, there are responses to this. I think the two main areas of responses to this area of argumentation is comparing how many of the things which I just discussed are true for private actors, private companies as well, and then weighing where it is more likely. I think the second one is, in terms of a general accountability mechanism, I think there is an interesting discussion to be had on elections. So typically, why we have elections, other than letting people have their say, is as an accountability mechanism. If you're crap and 4 years of power, I have the possibility to remove you from office. I think there is I think the responses to that response are, one, often the way you perceive reality is largely shaped by the media and indirect interaction rather than direct. So you often don't have an accurate picture as a voter. Two, no voter really has an incentive, and this is generally useful for all debates about referendums. No voter really has an incentive to get very well informed. Because if you think about it, the likelihood of your particular vote changing the election is next to zero, which means even if you make a vote based on wrong information, it's unlikely to make a big dent, so people don't have the impression that their vote is extremely important in many cases. So they vote on base who they liked on TV or what they read in the Daily Mail. And that's obviously the clash point you get into there. So where does this fit into the broader framework we initially discussed? This is where you could claim that states are awful at providing services to, let's say immigrants or refugees. And they're especially bad at providing services to immigrants or refugees who don't even have the slightest accountability mechanism, which is the right to vote. I think the last thing you say on that point of accountability is most bureaucracies and most of the public sector isn't really elected anyway. So while your local MP is, the clerk you see in the municipal office or in the state parliament mostly is not. And many of those people are relatively independent in making their own decisions. I mean, a good illustration of that, because the inner workings of government bureaucracies are very boring and dry, but a good illustration of that is if you watch TV series like Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, where you get unelected bureaucrats constantly trying to screw over and keep the level of information available to elected politicians to a minimum, because if they let them know enough, then there is not really a big reason to keep them. So I think this is one area which you can broadly explore when it comes to discussing the state as an allocator of resources. Does this make sense? Yes, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So can we then say that with this, the chapter on immigration is closed? Cool. So let's cover the issue which I found particularly interesting, and then we can go into trade, which is how to approach debates when people don't know things. I think this is a fairly good question, and one I've been thinking about for the last half an hour, probably. So, I think this probably depends from case to case. For instance, because you raised the question, I mean, most people know you, so even if they're not sure what you're talking about, they'll probably give you credit for it to an extent. If you're less experienced or less well-known in a circuit, it gets slightly complicated. So, I think, let's say, considering the level of the majority of the group, what I think I raised as a first point is, and this is more about your Euros and Worlds prep. So the reality of Euros and Worlds is that most time when they're allocating judges to rooms is spent on the top 25% of rooms, which means that if you're lower than that, there is a higher likelihood of getting not great judges. And if you're in the bottom quarter of a large competition or of Euros in the world, you're especially likely to get very bad judges. So what happens if, say, you had a good round one, got a second, then you got a fourth by some idiot, or you were unlucky in round two. So you're in a relatively crappy room. And you have a case, let's say, about the area you wrote a thesis on, so you know everything about it. You know all about mining in Mongolia, but no one in the room knows anything about it. My way of how I dealt with that, at least when I was very, very inexperienced, was, despite knowing a lot about emotion, one, in prep time, I mean this depends on team dynamics, but try to see who is the more destructive part of the team, and have that person constantly questioning why. I mean, that is how I got through a world quarters where I knew everything about the motion, but most people did not. It was about Arab nationalism in the 60s. But I had the fortunate aspect of having a partner who did not know a lot about that said motion area, and I was constantly asked why to a point I got really annoyed, but it did help our case. So ask yourself why until you reach a point where it becomes obvious to everyone. I think the second thing, and somewhat related to this, is focus a bit more on impact. As attractive as it may look to talk about everything you know about emotion, make 6 points in 7 minutes and explain them as well as you can. In reality, especially judges who do not have the slightest fuck about an area will not understand most of those points. Or if you're uncertain your judge is an intelligent human being, the way I do it is talk slowly, but also spend much more time on explaining the impacts of your arguments. And you can be very explicit with that. So you can have a separate 2 minutes, or you can spend half the time in a certain point explaining the argument. So the way you do that, why I did that when I would end up in lower rooms at big internationals is, true, you're probably sacrificing 2 speaks for that. You will probably had your judge known as much as you do about the motion. You might have gotten 2 or 3 speaks more, but the risk is much greater. Which is the risk is you might end up taking a fourth and losing much more than that. So I think that's one of the areas of focus you could have when you end up with a not particularly good judge. Let's see about. I think these are the main ones when you're not certain about how much your judge knows. In terms of when you're not certain about how much teams know, it seems tempting to try and refute everything they said because it's stupid. If they know very little, I'd focus on 2 things. One, what would sound compelling in a purely logical sense? I don't think you should ever shut that off when you're doing a motion you know everything about. So try and at least, even though you think they're being damn stupid at that point, try to at least comprehend whether it makes logical sense. If it makes logical sense, respond to it. If it does not, do not respond to it. 2, and this especially is an issue for people before they get structured in speaking, think about whether that extra point of rebuttal when you point out they had a really stupid example and the exact opposite happened in Papua New Guinea, not what they claim, is worth the time you will spend on it. So in order to do the rebuttal successfully, you probably have to at least flag things you're responding to. That on a minimum waits 20 seconds. 20 seconds is enough to flesh out 2 separate impacts of an argument. Drop pieces of rebuttal that are non-essential to the case. I think the final bit is especially with judges who do not know a lot a lot about a certain area, but this somewhat relates to the second point I said. Do focus on making points ultra clear, and don't try and make too many of them, even if you do have enough time. So, yeah, I think those are some of the ideas. So, overall, focus much more on impacts. Regarding teams, don't try to respond to everything they said, even though it seems incredibly tempting, and speak a bit more clearer and a bit more slower when it comes to that. Whereas if people know who you are, then just screw it. Feel free to at points use technical jargon if you're aware teams don't understand you. I may or may have not done that on a few instances. I mean, you could also do it strategically. So I think in situations, let's say you're in a good room, you have a good judge, you have 3 good teams, including yourself, and you have a crappy team who end up they're lucky. I mean, I think that's a slightly different strategy, and if you solely care about winning, you could at that point try and shut them out of the debate by making it technical at beginnings and using complicated econ lingo so that they feel a bit intimidated. That depends how you weigh the I want to be nice to new people versus I want to beat those same new people and get an 85. Does that answer the question, and do you have any ideas on that? Because I think it's a fairly good question.
Yeah, so I think it answers how to approach judges mostly. What I'm still not quite sure on is basically what to do when you are in either end of the debate, so either in OG or CO, and the rest of the teams and presumably the judges are on a similar level of knowledge or other lack of knowledge on the issue. Because I feel like these are the debates when it's most easy to just fall out of it completely. So when you discuss, especially with economics motion I find and IR motions, when the rest of the room agrees on completely false pretenses and false principles that do not work, their cases can sound logical and their cases can sound impactful without actually being so. And so then you have to decide what you engage with and what you try to rebut, as you said.
Yeah.
And I'm still not quite sure on how is it best approached.
So I think that's a good point. Realistically, let's say you're in the CO in said debate, you could sacrifice 4 minutes reframing the debate. I think the, let's say, litmus test there is, do you think that judge will buy it? Do you think they will just revert back to judging what's easy, or do you think they'll listen to you reframing the debate for 4 minutes? I mean, if you are successful, then presumably you can just make the simplest argument after that and win on that purely based on the fact that other people were talking crap. Yeah, it depends on weighing the risk. I mean, the contrast to that is you could end up losing massive speaks and getting like a 76, 74 win in a bad room. Just think on how exotic your judge will be with accepting a reframing from, let's say, CO. And I'm not sure there is a general answer to that, rather than what do you think the judge will buy, how exotic do you think the judge will be. One thing you could try and do is try and be very active with POIs explaining why they challenge premises as soon as possible, possibly do that in a point of clarification as soon as possible, not by attacking them in a point of clarification, but trying to frame the debate in a point of clarification is probably the best approach at the beginning. But if it doesn't go successful, then you can go anywhere from there, I guess. So can we consider this chapter closed? Cool. How much time do we have left? How much?
As much as you require.
Okay, so what time it is now? It is 7:40, so I have been speaking for 1 hour and 10 minutes. I think I can wrap this up in... So I think what will be difficult to cover will be the first two areas, because I think they are very specific and very broad, and we can go into anything there. What I would suggest is going into the things I wanted to discuss on trade, including specifically protectionism, and then at the end seeing how much willing are people to cope with me, and possibly whether we can make the first 2 points slightly more specific, and then discuss that for a few minutes. Is that fine for people? Cool. So let's actually go into protectionism first. So we had a point raised on that. So what was the specific question we had about protectionism? How you run protectionist arguments, how you opt protectionist arguments? I can't recall who asked that or who raised that point. Could be that someone who left.
Maybe my friend who left.
Yeah. Okay. Do people, let's say, what protectionist arguments or arguments for raising tariffs, import, blah, 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 do you commonly encounter? Let's start from that. Let me ask a question.
Defending the developing economy for the sake of the people and not getting swarmed by products from highly experienced, highly advanced, highly technologically advanced economies.
Yeah, that is the classic protectionist argument. It is the infant industry argument, and it is fairly compelling. And if you recall the second caveat I made at the beginning, that often we are inaccurate economically, but when something sounds logically compelling, it is very useful for debating. The infant industry argument is a classic example of that. The infant industry argument says the following: we have small industries. They are trying to develop. They are unable to compete on fair grounds with large multinationals for several reasons. One, those multinationals have much stronger reputations, which we don't have. So I'm fairly certain that fairy detergent for dishes is something which I know, but I have no idea what a local detergent is. So it means I can't compete with them. If I charge the same price, people will just buy fairy. Two, they have economies of scale. There are often some fixed expenses like plants, expenses like HR, expenses like finance, that can be spread out when you have a large production. But when you're a small firm, you don't have the resources to start that large production. And that's obviously those fixed costs have to be spread out over your products, which means that you are often not even able to charge let alone a lower price, but the same price as a big multinational. Three, they often have expertise and know-how. They usually have people who are scientists, who are developers, who know far more than people whom you are able to hire or people whom you have. Four, they often have much better access to retail chains, to wholesalers. They have relationships which you do not have. Fifthly, they have better access to market research, needs of consumers, marketing strategies, opportunities to hire expensive consultants, etc., etc. Which means that you have to level the playing field against them by increasing tariffs or introducing quotas or other non-tariff measures. The argument is fairly simple, right? So probably in a debating sense, not in a strictly economical one, probably the most compelling defense of this comes from a heterodox economist from the University of Cambridge called Ha-Joon Chung, a South Korean professor who wrote quite a few books, most of which are quite popular with debaters. If you do not know anything about economics but you'd like to know more, you can probably read his 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. If you'd like to know a bit more about protectionism specifically, you can read Kicking Away the Ladder. He largely, in his analysis, focuses on how strong protectionist measures help develop fledgling industries in South Korea and Japan. For instance, Samsung initially started as a fish exporter, but through protectionist measures managed to develop into an industrial and later industrial and high-tech IT firm. The reason why they did that was because they had close dealings with the South Korean government and focused on their export-driven growth together. So they had a mutual understanding with the government. And that's what you typically make as the argument. What people typically do not look at, and I think this is the way of upping the protectionist line, or this specific argument. So I think the arguments against protectionism in general are also to an extent intuitive. People are able to buy cheaper products. People are able to buy nicer products. You get some, if you get multinationals going in, you get some knowledge spillover. So I work for Microsoft, I learn a bit more about IT than had I just worked for a local startup, so I start a better startup than the one I would have initially started. So those are the fairly obvious arguments for a general free trade model. What I think is interesting, though, is that in many debates about protectionism, people just run those counter-arguments without exactly dealing with the infant industry argument's logic. So what I think is interesting there is we talk about successful examples, and they're quite famous, but there are quite a few examples that were unsuccessful that people don't talk about as much. So, for instance, South America largely tried to develop its IT and telecommunication industries through similar measures as Korea and Japan did in the 50s and 60s. South American countries tried to do in the 70s and early 80s. Those measures failed miserably in 85, partially as a result of their debt crisis, which was partially caused by an international credit crunch, but also partially because they were taking huge chunks of debt in order to finance those very same industries. They just had bad strategic focus. So I think when you point that out, if you say, look, there are successful examples, there are less successful examples. The question is not about whether Korea was able to do it, but whether states are able to pick winners or not. And I think that's a point where you are able to get back to the original point I discussed roughly 45 minutes ago, on whether states or private actors are better allocators of resources and capital, but also of protecting general interests of countries. Does this make sense to people? So looking at whether states are efficient at allocating resources, whether you help a firm develop or just engage in corruption and overcharge your own consumers because you're only in office for 4 years anyways. I think it's interesting, especially looking how various political dynasties did that. The Gandhis in India largely did that, less successfully. The Lee family in Singapore managed to do this, even though Singapore is a slightly different example than other protectionist countries. But they did manage to very successfully develop the city-state into one of the most developed economies in the world. So in terms of those protectionist arguments, I definitely suggest trying to, rather than nitpicking examples, take people back to the logic and then go into a fairly intuitive argument on whether states are good allocators of resources or not. Does this make sense? Cool. There's one last thing I want to cover before we go into the first 2 points. So one of the arguments I've seen run a million times in debating is the argument of the race to the bottom. Are people familiar with it?
Can you repeat?
The race to the bottom argument. Yes?
It's a thing that occurs in like federal states usually, when you have different states with different regulations, and like you have like capital outflows to a certain state or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they compete by like deregulating stuff and attracting capital this way.
Yeah, I mean, it is not limited to federal states. So the argument, it's mainly ran by anti-globalists. So the argument is, it mainly applies for 2 areas, labor standards and environmental standards. In order to attract international investment, countries will drastically lower their labor and international standards. So it happens within federal state, but it also happens at a more international level. Consequently, other states will also lower their standards of labor and the environment in order for them to be able to attract investment. And overall what happens, because we have more countries who need investments than companies who are willing to invest, is that you end up with very low labor and environmental standards in many developing countries around the world. Does this argument sound intuitive to people?
Yeah.
So this is something, for instance, I didn't buy back when I was in my second year of debating, and an argument I intensively focused on. And I even wrote a paper on it. So the issue is the logic of the race to the bottom is based on two premises. Premise number one is countries will lower standards in order to attract investment. Actually, three premises. So this is the first one. The second one is lowering standards will attract investment. And premise number three is if you increase your regulation or make it stricter, capital will outflow from your countries. And actually, a lot of studies on the matter make it very, very unclear as to whether the race to the bottom exists in general. And rather than directing you and saying this study says this study says that, the American political economist Daniel Bresner wrote a good paper that is pretty much a summary of all studies on the race to the bottom. It's about 20 pages, and it's not difficult to read even for people who are not economists. So if you're interested in those sorts of things and what statistical models said, it's worth reading. What I want to focus more though is the logic of the race to the bottom, because that's what you'll debate a bit more. And a few examples. I think there are a few reasons why the race to the bottom won't necessarily happen, which deal with the two premises which I discussed. I think the first thing that's worth pointing out is that in many countries, increasing standards will not lead to capital outflows. For instance, most people have I think almost all people by this point have smartphones. Your LED or your LCD screens are made from for a number of chemicals, one of which or ingredients is rare earth minerals. 99% of rare earths, roughly, between 95 and 99, depends on the studies you read, can be found in China. Hypothetically, I mean, China isn't exactly a developing country anymore, but hypothetically, if China drastically increased its labor standards for mines, you'd still have people going into mines to mine those rare earths, because it's difficult to find them elsewhere. And it's true for a lot of resources. It's true for a lot of oil and natural gas. It is true for uranium. It is true to an extent for bauxite, but not as much. So in many areas, you just simply can't find the natural resources which you can find elsewhere. So you can't just build a mine elsewhere if South Africa raises labor standards in its gold mines. I think the second point there is, so this also depends on the statistics which you get, but roughly 70% of total production that results from foreign direct investment, so made by multinational factories and plants, whatever, is for local and regional markets. To make this closer to you, when Coca-Cola builds, and Coca-Cola is obviously present throughout the world, Coca-Cola usually builds a factory for about every 10 to 15 million consumers, so I think there are about 2 or 3 covering the Polish market, whereas where I come from, Serbia, which has a population of about 7 million people, Coca-Cola is also covering the Kosovar, Bosnian, and Montenegrin markets as well, which adds up to like 12 million people. So the point is, because Coke is relatively simple to make, it's the fancy recipe, it's sugar and it's carbonated water, it's not particularly expensive. It's mostly done by machine, so you don't have huge labor costs. The larger costs, however, are transportation. That's why it's not produced in the US and shipped elsewhere around the world, because it's not really light. It's a 1 or 2 liter bottle that weighs 1 or 2 kilograms and makes quite a bit of space. So they produce it in local markets. Presumably, even in countries, say, raise not so much their labor standards, but let's say their environmental standards, because Coke has had some issues in some developing countries, including places like Swaziland. You'd still have Coke presumably present on those markets, because you want people in those markets to be able to drink Coke, and you don't want to lose those consumers to Pepsi or other competitors. think the third thing I'd point out here as a sort of a response to the race of the bottom argument is that often, and I think this is where things like comparatives in debating get useful, multinationals do care about reputational risk because it makes it very difficult for them to get deals elsewhere. And this obviously can be responded to flippantly. So here are two examples. I think if you want to make these sorts of claims because big companies are evil for some reason, probably need to back them up with examples. So for instance, PepsiCo pulled out of Myanmar in '97 because they did not want to be connected with the oppressive regime there in any way. Whereas General Electric was one of the main lobbyists for the OECD anti-bribery convention. I think that there is an interesting point to be made here. The comparative isn't about whether big companies do bad things. They obviously do. It should be compared with companies who operate in local markets, which is if a large multinational is not polluting, is polluting, why do you not think that a local factory would do so as well? Often when there are lower pressures. And this is where it gets fairly interesting. So one of these studies which I read showed a strong correlation between legislation, it mostly related to the environment, between legislation on foreign direct investment and how strict it is, and the level of pollution. Now this may sound counterintuitive, but the logic was the following. Big companies, especially in polluting sectors, so like oil companies, put strong pressure on their governments and they lobby their governments to not make stricter environmental regulation and to loosen up the one which currently exists. What they do, I mean, if you read the donor lists in Congress or the Senate, you'll see clear proof of this. What is interesting, however, is that at the point when that legislation is enacted, when you say get stricter environmental legislation, they often, not always, put pressure on governments of developing countries to introduce similar legislation. Now you might for a second ask yourself, why the hell would they do that? Presumably, stricter environmental standards would be more expensive. But here is the interesting bit of logic. When we were discussing the infant industry argument, what we pointed out is that big multinationals are comparably much more likely to be able to afford specialist and fancy technologies compared to smaller emerging industries. What that means for this argument is, even if, say, your cost gets slightly more expensive as a result of, say, a developing country introducing stricter environmental regulation, you are able to shoulder those costs. A small producer who is a competitor in your local market, say a local car producer, finds it far more expensive to shoulder those exact same costs because of the same reasons that exist for infant industries. At that point, even though your cost base increases slightly, it increases much more for your competitors who are smaller players in said markets, to an extent that they often aren't able to reach their break-even level, so to not make a loss, and you end up ultimately capturing a greater market share. Again, this does not happen in all cases, but it is a reason that is logically, at least, not ridiculous as to why big companies might not always lobby for pollution. I think there are two far more intuitive reasons, which I don't feel like need to go into great detail. One is, even in developing countries, there are other interest groups. They are not completely run by foreign multinationals. You often have local groups, local parties, citizens, etc., etc. Two, all of this assumes zero capital cost. So if I have a factory in a country and it slightly raises its labor standards, I probably won't move it elsewhere because I already have the factory built there, I have vendors there, I have a transport network there, I know the local market there, etc., etc. I'll make a caveat at the end. Even though, so the conclusion I reach is that there is no compelling proof that a race to the bottom exists. It does happen in two industries. It happens in international shipping. As you know, in international waters, in ships, the labor law that applies is under the country is the labor law of the country under whose flag it sails. That's why most super tankers or large cargo ships are registered in either small exotic Caribbean countries with no minimum wages and no hour limitations, or in a handful of Gold Coast West African states. The reason it happens is because it's not that expensive to register a ship somewhere, and because it sails, you don't really need to access the local market. It's a question whether your tanker ship that's registered in Liberia will ever even sail to Freetown. The other industry where the race to the bottom does to a large extent happen is the textile and garment industry, because the cost of material are really, really cheap. I assume most of the people in this room, the clothes you're wearing probably didn't cost more than 5 or 6 euros to produce. The same applies for me as well. The materials themselves probably didn't cost more than 5 or 6 euros in total. However, we still haven't fully developed machines in this respect, so most clothes are still at least to a part handmade. The machines that are used in the process are not that expensive and not that large, so it's fairly simple to move them. And because clothes don't take up too much space, shipping and transport costs aren't that high. That's why clothes made in Bangladesh or Indonesia are relatively cheap in Europe. The point is, that's why they are incredibly sensitive to changes in labor laws, and that's why almost all clothes, except of course for the ones that are made responsibly, are still produced in sweatshops around the world. So it is not as true for most other industries. So what I wanted to cover in this bit was mostly the sorts of responses you give to the race to the bottom argument, which the argument itself is fairly intuitive. Do you have a question? No, cool. So at this point, I have reached the end of what I wanted to talk about, and we do have the first 2 points that were raised. So the question now is, do people want us to go through those first 2 points, or do people want to stop now?
Do we vote, or?
Let's have a vote. So I've been talking for exactly 1 hour and 30 minutes, which is how long the workshop was originally scheduled to last for. How much would people like to talk to me for another 10 to 15 minutes, I assume? Or would they rather we end now and go to wherever we're supposed to go to? So let's have a vote. Who wants to discuss the first 2 issues? Okay, who does not want to discuss them?
Going to address the social will be 20, half of 20.
So in 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And we were walking to from the hotel at 9, 8.
Yeah.
So we have time. Okay. So let's discuss the first 2 issues. I mean, international market and two-speed European Union can mean a plethora of things. Yes?
Before that, just on the race to the bottom.
Yes.
I think it's just interesting to note that in most debates, the race to the bottom is applied more narrowly into specific cases.
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about the EU and the race to the bottom, especially with regards to the EU 10 plus 2 plus 1 countries joining in the 21st century, it's mostly about new foreign direct investment. So we are not really discussing Renault closing down a factory in France and then moving it to Romania, but rather when they decide to build a new factory, then it will be a race between Hungary, Slovakia, Romania and Poland, and part of the race will be how much tax benefits or like tax credits they will give to this company, how much regulations they will have with how much land they will give. I think there the case is much more compelling as to why that would happen.
Yeah, I think in terms of tax benefits, there is quite a fair race at the bottom there. I think that's the first thing I'd point out there. I think the second thing I just point out is that, you probably don't get it about new, broader foreign direct investment, but you do get debates about increasing standards for whatever in many developing countries. So, like, requiring that products sold in the West adhere to same then you have an empty line, environmental, labor, whatever standards, as they do in the West. And I think these sorts of arguments can be applicable for those sorts of debates. You also can use many of these arguments in debates about free economic zones, or in general about market liberalization, whether it's attractiveness. But I think, yeah, that is a fair point, that a lot of the things which we discussed are not applicable in cases of, say, let's say, mid-developed countries, like most of the eastern part of the European Union. Some bits are, but large swaths are not. I think that's a fair point. So, in terms of the two-speed EU, this is a very broad area, so let's try and narrow it down a little. What would people like to discuss about international markets and the two-speed EU in specific? I recall faintly that question was posed somewhere here.
Yeah, it's actually specifically because we had last week, like 2 weeks ago at Białystok, we had a motion about to speak European Union. That actually the debate was like, well, that was pretty.
Actually, the debate was all about kind of assuming that it would mean the richer countries just not supporting the poorer countries at all, and it was about is that okay? But it was kind of assumed.
So, what typically at least as far as I understand the concept, what typically the two-speed EU means is that part of Europe would enter into more intensive or stronger integration, and that part of it would, not only economic but also political integration, but that part would largely remain in a economic union with a few political elements. I guess you could claim that to an extent the Eurozone and non-Eurozone areas were for most of time an example of that. It's not as much currently because exchange rates are mostly fixed within the non-Eurozone member states. What I think that discussion or that debate ends up being about is a few points. I think it ends up about politically being on whether you're able to have broader integration at all, considering the problems that exist within Europe. Euroscepticism is not limited to the United Kingdom, and there are many parties in many countries that are getting stronger. In terms of the specific relations between Eastern and Western Europe, I mean, yeah, to an extent, countries in Eastern Europe have been harmed from access to the common market because of more efficient products from the Western Europe. On the other hand, they have been beneficiaries of EU funds. What I think is difficult, though, about the concept of a two-speed Europe is that the concept itself has been thrown around for as long as I can remember, and no one even knows what it means exactly, aside that one group of countries will be more integrated than a separate group of countries. But, I mean, did you have an info slide in that motion?
Yeah, it is the definition that Eurozone and non-Eurozone, and
it was thrown up by the Benelux at Malta.
Yeah, that's proposed by the Benelux countries, and nothing else, pretty much.
So, like, one of the debating points was that it was created by the Benelux.
So it will benefit Benelux. So it was.
Or they think so.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, the topic was that the European Union should introduce the European of two speeds, and that was based on some summit in February in Malta.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things you can talk about, but none in specific, because, I mean, Sarkozy was talking about two-speed Europe about 5 years ago. You had different chats about it in Germany in the decade before that.
Merkel is talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, she is. But I think it's a political concept that gets thrown around and no one knows what it really means. But I think you could, to try and narrow it down, the two areas you can discuss are Euroscepticism. I think the second one is about, so nominally, post-Lisbon Treaty, what's interesting is that all new members should aim to adopt the euro at one point. The European Union loses all meaning without the common market. So it's difficult to not have the common market between both speeds in a two-speed Europe. I think there is a more interesting discussion to be had on whether the introduction of the euro is or was a good idea. And this somewhat feeds into your second point, so about currencies in general. One of the main issues with the euro is that it is effectively a currency that is run by the Germans, i.e. the focus of the European Central Bank is on low rates of inflation. Am I going a bit too fast here? Are people aware of what concepts like inflation mean? Yeah. So inflation is the rise in consumer prices. But what's important though is that salaries for most individuals are fixed or in nominal amounts. So typically, when your country is less competitive for whatever reason, worse infrastructure, worse regulation, complicated laws, inefficient companies, debt crisis, and as in the case of Greece, the way you would typically solve for that issue was by printing out money. What that lead to is higher rates of inflation, which means effectively they'd also impact the exchange rate. So instead of trading, say, €1 for 100 drachmas, you end up trading €1 for 150 drachmas. But someone still gets a salary of, 100,000 drachmas. But all of a sudden that salary is lower by 1/3 but nominated in euros, which means products produced in Greece, say, get more competitive compared to the status quo. The issue which exists with the euro, though, is that you are unable to do so at the moment, at which point when everyone has salaries denominated in euros, and people for different reasons find it much more easier to accept inflation than to accept a nominal decrease in salaries. So where I come from, which is Serbia, had a relatively high rate of inflation in the early 2000s, like somewhere close to 10%. No one gave a damn about it. People gave a damn about it, but nothing big happened. Whereas a few years later, someone nominally cut salaries of government employees by 5%, and all of a sudden you get protests. So it's very difficult to cut wages of people. The issue with the introduction of the euro everywhere is that you will get more competitive or more developed countries, like primarily Germany and France, but especially Germany, dominating the markets of other countries without allowing for them to become competitive through effectively depreciating their currency through printing extra money. And that is one of the main economic problems that has made the Eurozone crisis so prolonged. So for instance, while the US managed to pull out of the economic crisis in a few years, the European was much more deep because you couldn't revert back to something that resembles an equilibrium quickly because you had a great disparity in wages between the North and South or East and West. So I guess to an extent a two-speed Europe could solve that by keeping a free market, but say your German Bosch machines would all of a sudden become much more expensive in Greece once the drachma is flooded. So I think that's a way in which you can discuss the economic bits of a two-speed Europe, which is that currently when you have a common market with a common currency, one country ends up dominating most of the other countries. I think that's one area that can be discussed there. Yes?
So what you're saying about the currencies is that, well, if we do this to speak Europe, then some countries that are not that well prepared for the euro and still have it, then they would go back to their previous currency and they would control their market.
That depends on OG. You could make a claim that, so yeah, I think Greece should probably, I would struggle to imagine Greece being part of the faster speed in a two-speed Europe. Probably Spain wouldn't either. Italy is a good question whether it would. So the question is, how would you model it? And that this is where we actually get into complicated economics, which are far too late to discuss. But the point is, if Greece went back to the drachma, it would depreciate terribly much. But I think you could definitely make the claim that Poland should never introduce the euro, or that quite a few other countries haven't introduced it so far, like the Czech Republic should not do as well. I think actually what I read somewhere was that the Czech Republic versus Slovakia is a fairly good example of how one country managed to recover from the recession faster than the other, because the Czech Republic did depreciate its krona a bit, whereas Slovakia introduced the euro, I think, fairly early, somewhere like 2011 or 2012, and that created issues when Europe went into a recession again in 2013. So, because they weren't able to decrease their wages effectively by printing money. So yes, what you could claim is that it could make some countries more competitive for industrial goods and exporting things.
Well, actually, Slovakia, I think earlier, because I was very little when I was in Slovakia once, and they had euros already. So it was before 2011. I'm pretty sure.
So Slovakia got into the Union in 2004, as most other as the rest of the bloc did. I think the first country that introduced the euro was Slovenia, actually, from that group of countries, and they did it in 2000 and in I think late 2008 or early 2009. So yeah, could have been slightly earlier than that, but I think the overall point stands.
Yeah.
They introduced it in 2009, January.
Ah, perfect.
I mean, we have Google in 2009.
Yeah. But I don't currently. I mean, it'd be a bit awkward if I was Googling things while talking to you guys, wouldn't it? So, does this partially, or in part answer the question? So do we have any other questions at this point? I mean, I could go into financial markets, but that is really a workshop on itself. Like how to price derivatives and etc. Do we have any other questions or anything that people would like for us to cover now that we have not covered so far?
I have a question concerning way back what we talked about. It's kind of one of your general things you said. I just wanted to make sure I got the logic behind it correctly. It was basically about money in general, as you said, like money itself that you're losing. That you lose like 1 billion doesn't really mean anything, and what you said there, I'm not sure whether you meant that, so I just want to recheck that basically you lose money. That means the state literally cannot provide the same level of services under the same circumstances if the same amount of people, etc., are still being there, which means that under the same conditions unemployment might rise, which means that some people might not get the same amount of health services, etc., which would mean that either that more people will get depressed, which means that more suicide rates, and that means that everything will die in the long run. Well, except for the last part.
I mean, I honestly have been talking for close to 2 hours, so I have no idea when I exactly made that point.
I mean, I think it was after my question, like how do you weigh like loss of money when a lot of judges claim that you can just print them versus some higher values like freedom of expression, freedom of being yourself, etc.
Essentially, more people die, more people live in abject poverty. I think most judges will be able to understand what those two things mean. And usually, if you get a lower tax base or a lower amount of money in the economy in general, then one of those or both of those two things might commonly happen.
Okay, but like based on the question based on the topic that I had on my first tournament, there was a motion on incest and that we should legalize it or depenalize it, doesn't matter. And I wanted to run the case showing that if we have incest, then we have more genetic diseases, and they are extremely costly to be treated, and then you have just more and more of them.
Sure, but
like the judges didn't really care about the idea that we are going to have extremely costly diseases.
So if you legalize incest, do you really think that every other person would bang their sister?
Actually, we were in the same room and we won the debate in arguing that there wouldn't be that many children, so the cost wouldn't be.
I mean, yeah, that's the point.
The main point is
it is just. I mean, incest is one of the few things that so many different human societies throughout history has been largely stigmatized, obviously with exceptions. It is one of the most common stigmas that exists within humans in general. I don't imagine that legalizing it would.
Okay, so that's a very particular case, but like
I mean,
coming
yeah.
back to the original question, like if you have a topic on a completely different manner, and like the economical harms are just one of your, let's say, argument or sub-argument, and you don't really have 3 or 4 minutes to spend on it, it's hard to show rational harms in terms of economics because you have to explain how it goes in just like 1 or 2 minutes.
So, is it related to this?
It's an answer.
Okay, yeah, let's hear it. I have 2 responses, but let's hear yours first.
In the end, I would say you can very quickly explain that money in most of the cases can be a proxy to happiness in some way. So if we spend less money on something, or if we waste less money on something that we don't want, we can have more money that we can spend on something that generates happiness.
Yeah, but
and then you can give examples.
But this assumes that the majority of judges agree that you have a fixed amount of money, and they don't.
Opportunity cost should be a
So,
concept.
I think there are 2 things which help with that directly. So, one, I think unless you can prove that the cost of a particular policy would be something similar to all money in existence, you probably don't run the cost argument. So if it's something like nationalize the construction industry, you can probably show that it screws up the economy so massively that you don't get hundreds of other things. If you have the incest case, you can't really prove that. I think the general litmus test is, and this is something Americans typically do, if someone says it'll cost money, people just show up and say, we'll just cut military spending. Because in the US, they spend about 18% of their federal budget on the army, which comes down to somewhere, I don't know, it is in hundreds of billions of dollars. So as long as the response to that can't be something as flippant as, we'll just cut military spending because debaters don't like the army because they presumably don't like people with guns and wars, etc., then there is a point about making that argument. Otherwise, it is difficult. The reason why judges do that is not just because most of them don't understand economics, but because you're spending 56 minutes discussing the merits and harms of a particular thing, whether a particular thing is good and bad. If you say, but that will cost money, then that pretty much ruins 90% of debates, because there is always an opportunity cost to everything people do, but you want to instead focus on whether a particular thing is good or bad. That's why I think the bar for it costs money is relatively high, such as this costs more money than the entirety of money we have. Yes?
Yeah, because in this particular debate about incest, I do believe judge after that told that this debate was meant to be a debate on values, and I guess the economic argument is marginal in that one, in that case.
I mean, let's say it is a bad way of putting through something similar to what I said, which is that we're discussing the merits and harms of the policy. Yeah. But it's not just about that. It's that I'm telling you what will happen if you had slightly more experienced speakers there who would go into the intricacies, the details. You would essentially have someone saying, let's just cut military spending, you can fund this policy. Military spending is less important than someone being able to have sex with their sister and enjoy it. Cool. Any other questions? Not related to incest. Okay, can we close here then? Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for bearing with me. Sorry for being late again, and sorry for taking a bit longer with this.
So, from the organization side, the walking bus will go from the hostel. So now you can go to the hostel and then we'll pick you up. Is there anyone, is there anyone who wants to go to the social from here?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you can say, and I will say.
Stefan? Yes? Have you read the book, The Justice from Michael Sandel?
I've read bits of it.
Because I've read the book and I'm curious whether he covered more in his video series.
Roughly the videos cover, as far as I know, every video covers one of the chapters. The book covers it in slightly more detail, essentially. I mean, I didn't read too much on it because I lost my interest, even though I studied political sciences, I lost my interest in political philosophy fairly early and focused on more practical things. He's a great writer.
You can even treat it just as a cool book to read.
It's a great book. Tak, we need to grab
Many burgers. Okej, weźcie Stefana i ten. I na szewskiej na pewno jest jakieś burgery, które są mięsne.
To niech prekusy jakieś. Ja nie mam pojęcia, że szewskiej nie. Ja będę jeszcze.
Zgadniesz? Okej, Szewska 16 to jest lokal. Czy nie macie Google Maps?
Nie mamy stary, nie mamy Google Maps, nie przechwalę się, że masz.
Szewska 16. Tak zapomniałem, że jest tylko wiesz dla wybranych. No i zobaczycie. Okej, dobra. Czyli no Szewska idzie od Bagatynnego. Okej, so you go together. Co? Nie powiem ci jak idzie do sąsiednia? Na drugą średnią? To się nazywa lotba. Gdzie jest Mark?
Jan, tak orientacyjnie, jak daleko jest ta stacja?
It's still live. Oh no. Finish it.
Jak daleko jest stacja?